All right, so the last piece is I want to be able to take the value in the text box and put it in the label. So we'll start with an empty control, save that. To wire up to this button, to handle the click event, you simply have to go to the button and double click. Visual Studio will generate what's called an event handler for that button click event. And then you code inside of this method, this event handler, what you want it to do when the button is clicked. Now, the button click isn't the only event. If we come back and look at our properties dialog, if you flip over to events, which is the lightning bolt, there's actually a ton of events that can be handled on a button click. Click is just the default event, as decided by the designer who wrote the class that is the button. So by double clicking the button, that default event gets wired up. If we want to wire up a different event, we simply come down here, we find the event that we want. Enter, for example, happens when the cursor enters into the zone where the button is drawn. If I want to wire up to this event, I just double click here. Visual Studio will generate another event handler function method for me. So now I have these two events happening on the same button. One happens when I click it. One happens when my cursor enters that zone or region that is the button. So on enter, we could say LBL output.text equals you're in the zone. Okay? This may end up backfiring, but we'll go with it. When the button is clicked, and you'll notice here, maybe it's a little hard to see, but it's private void btn go underscore click, and then it takes these two arguments of sender and event args. And we'll cover those in later weeks. What I want to have happen here is I want LBL output.text on click to equal txtvalue.text. Taking the text value from the text box, storing it in the label. And that's it. We hit start. Compiler runs, builds our app. Here's our app. I'll type in hello world. I'll click, and there's hello world. If I mouse out, mouse back in here. Oh, didn't do it. Let me look at what the enter event actually does. Oh, that occurs when the control becomes active on the form. So when the form first loaded, that's why that text appeared in the label. I don't really want that. Delete. So by deleting that, what I've now done is I've now decoupled the event from the event handler. So the event always exists. That's part of the button. You can't get rid of an event unless you override the button, create your own button class, and then you can remove that event. The event handler is the function that gets called when the event happens. By deleting that, I'm not deleting the function. I'm deleting the wire up between the two. that wire up, I'll put it back here so you can see. That wire up happens in this designer, this form1.designer.cs. If we open up this generated code, scroll down to the button, you'll see here the event wire up is this.btngo.click plus equals new system.event-handler this.btn_click. This part in the parentheses is the name of the function that gets called when the click happens. The line below it is the name of the function that we just saw on the other screen. It gets called when the enter event is raised. You can always tell when an event handler is getting wired up because it's always this kind of weird plus equals thing. And the reason why it's plus equals, does anybody know what a plus equals typically does?
It's like the same thing as writing it twice. It's just shorthand.
Say that again?
It's like shorthand instead of like doing like one equal, or I'm not explaining as well, but it's like at all. I know what it is. I just don't.
Okay. All right. You had your hand up before you to go.
I was gonna say equals all properties it already has plus whatever property you're assigning.
Correct. So in a more simplistic scenario, if I had I equals 0, and then I did I plus equals 1, what I'm doing is I equals I plus 1. So it's carrying what is currently there and then adding to it.
Do that with arrays?
With an array,
Yeah. Is it plus equal?
in terms of like adding an item to an array,
Yeah.
no. You still have to be able, you have to identify the indexer. So, and then most of your other classes that are collections, like lists, they have an add method. So if you did it with an array, you'd end up, I see where you're saying, but it doesn't work that way. It works on a single instance variable. But with the events become a chain of what are called delegates. So you're basically saying that when this event occurs, call every function or method that's wired up into that event. So we can actually have two things happen when you click a button. We can have an infinite number of things happen when you click a button. And just like that, you can also unsubscribe events or unsubscribe event handlers from events. So if you have a certain scenario where you're waiting for an event to happen, you actually can add that wire up in the other section of code, which is kind of your workspace that's outside of the designer space. You can wire up and say, I'm waiting for this event, and then once the event happens, then you can stop listening for it. So you can do a plus equals and add an event, and then you can do a minus equals and subtract. Typically, you do it through the designer, and you don't have to worry about it. But it's important to know this because people will do the opposite of what I've done. And they'll go, oh, I don't want to listen to enter anymore. I don't want to do that. Right? Get rid of it. Then they'll go back and go, what do I want to do? And they'll go, oh, Mr. Gantos broke it. And what happens here is when Visual Studio goes through and it digs through all that code and does all that parsing, it sees that there's an event handler wired up, but the method that's called when the event fires over here doesn't exist anymore. And the designer gets very angry and gives you this pretty little screen. Now, if you look at your error list, which is probably hiding here at the bottom, you'll see these options listed here. One's a red X, one's a blue one. The easiest solution to find the problem is to double click on the red one, and at Visual Studio will jump you to the line where that red squiggle exists. What it's essentially telling you, if you actually mouse over that squiggle, or look at the error says that Week 2, Part 2, Form 1, that's the class for our form, does not contain a definition of btn_go underscore enter. And no extension method, accepting the first argument of type, and then it goes into some details. Basically, it's saying that there is no definition for btn_go underscore enter. There is no method. There is no longer a method with that name. Therefore, we can do one of two things with this. We can recreate the method because we accidentally deleted it or renamed it. Or we don't need this anymore and we get rid of the line. By deleting that line, the designer comes back and it's happy again. People get hung up on that a lot, so I want to be sure to make a point of it. So again, this is just introductory, but this is the process of creating forms, adding controls to your forms, and beginning to interface with these events that these controls can raise. Text boxes can have events. They have events about every time the key press occurs, every time a character is inserted into a text box, it'll raise an event. You can do a check. You can actually look at the character that's being inserted into the text box and you can make a decision. Maybe you want to make that text box only accept numbers. If the character being entered is not a number, you can actually deny it from being added to the text box. When enter is pressed on the text box, you can have a certain thing happen. You know, just like in your URL address bar in your browser. You type in a URL, type in a website address, you hit enter, and it launches. That enter event is something that actually has to be wired up to happen. Otherwise, you hit enter and it doesn't do anything. So 90% of the time, and I say 90 because I can't think of a full 10% where it doesn't happen. 90% of the time, things that happen in your applications don't just happen. They're designed to do that. So an expectation of, oh, it just does that, is not a good expectation to have because you are the developer, you are the designer, you are the person responsible for making that application do what it does. There are conventions to how applications typically work, expectations that us as a society or as a culture have about how an application should work and function. I'm sure you've probably run across those programs where you've either downloaded it or used it and went, why did they put that button there? Or why when I click on this thing, it does something else than what I expected it to do? There's no hard, fast rules that have been defined, but we've been kind of indoctrinated into this expectation that you have an application and it has a menu bar. Well, where's the menu bar located? Top of the window. How would you feel if it was on the bottom of the window? On the left-hand side of the window. I mean, you know, it's that kind of thing where it's not wrong, technically, but we've been kind of trained to have this expectation. And if you want an application to be successful, you want an application to be well received, that user experience is an important thing to keep in mind. And you want to make it as familiar as possible so that it's as easy and intuitive for people to pick up and use. So if you want to put your menu bars on the bottom, that's okay. I don't care. It probably functions perfectly fine. But if you gave it to your mother or your grandmother, they would probably look at you and go, I don't know how to use this program. And they may look at you anyway and not know how to use the program, but you're not doing them any favors. So